Okay, guys, check 1, 2. I believe we are up and rolling. What's going on? Welcome back to another video on the channel here. Captain Cody Davis here with you guys again, as always. And whether you are new to the channel or even following me for a while, do me a favor. Bear with me on the audio on this video. I'm in the market for some new microphones. Unless I'm just nitpicking and being a pain in the ass and being extra picky, let me know in the comments if this audio comes through and sounds a little staticky to you guys, because I keep playing with it, and no matter how I set it or where I set it, I'm just not happy with the audio on these. But maybe I'm overthinking it. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. But either way, got something a little bit different for you guys today. Same old me sitting at my desk talking to a camera like I know what I'm talking about video. But I got kind of a cool topic that's really not ever talked about in any source of fishing media down here in South Florida. And I think a big reason for that is there's a lot of unknowns and question marks when it comes to this topic. And it's something I get asked a lot, a ton, both from customers or clients and bunch of times from people I grew up fishing with on the coast. And another reason I like talking about it too is because it's something that really intrigues me and something I'm really into and trying to just really put the pieces to the puzzle together ever since I moved up here in and around Lake Okeechobee. And basically, what the topic is you know like I guess we're going to be talking about snook, tarpon, jacks, ladyfish, whatever inshore species that more or less call Lake Okeechobee home. All right. I grew up in most of you know, but I grew up in the town of Deerfield Beach on the east coast of Florida, and spent most of my younger days, and still do, chasing snook, tarpon, jacks, and all the backwater canals, the inlets, the bridges along the beach, especially right now during the mullet run, which is what I should be doing tonight, but instead I'm here. Um, and when you grow up that close to the ocean, chasing these fish and offshore fish and things, I feel like you get a preconceived notion where you kind of like have you don't know it, but mentally you have kind of a border as to where the line stops in the backwater waterways where you will find these inshore species, snook, tarpon, jacks, etc. And I feel like we all have that because we're all somewhat spoiled living so close to the actual ocean and the inlets and things. Um, but we all know about we all everyone listening to this video, everyone watching this has spots where they know that there are landlocked saltwater species and the mixed in with freshwater species, whether it's golf course ponds, whether it's canals, whether it's residential lakes and ponds. There's thousands of them, but in and around Florida, all around. And we're talking snook, tarpon, jacks, ladyfish, things like that in this video, but we all, and I'm not going to name names and mention areas and stuff because there's been some shady things that have happened over the years, but there's some of us that know about ponds that are filled with gag grouper and mangrove snapper and permit and giant barracudas, cabera snappers. There are those odd things, but the thing that kind of sets them apart for the most part, from at least to my knowledge, is that a lot of these bodies of water are very close to the coast. All right, so very close to the intercoastal or very close actually to the beach. They're further east or west than this big puddle behind me, Lake Okeechobee, which is smack dab in the middle of the state. And I remember as a kid, a lot of people just kind of fill you guys in. I said I grew up in Deerfield Beach. I did live there 28 years, or me and my wife got married, and I moved out here and started guiding on Lake Okeechobee. But throughout my whole life, my dad was not a saltwater guy. We lived that close to the beach, and he could care less about saltwater. He was a bass guy, so we primarily bass fished growing up until I was old enough to get a car and drive around and really learn the saltwater thing. But I remember coming up here and staying at the Torrey Island campground down here on the south end of the lake, very close to where I live now. And Slim's had a bait and tackle shop there, which is still there today. But they used to have Polaroid pictures. I feel like every tackle shop in the world had Polaroid pictures on display. And I remember, I believe it was almost like a basket full of them. And I remember me and my brother being up there one day. I was probably 7 or 8 years old, and looking through these Polaroids, and there was a good number of them with people holding snook. And I thought that was so crazy. And I remember asking my brother, I had never even caught a snook at that time, but I was like, they catch snook in here? And he said, yeah, I mean, I guess. But maybe, they could be, maybe they're locals that live in town and are driving, to the coast to snook fish and taking pictures there. You never knew, never know. And then throughout the years, I I'd know people that fished Lake Okeechobee almost religiously, and I'd hear stories, and then I'd hear things about tarpon and snook being in there, and then it really makes sense. Okay, it does, because there are tons of channels and river systems that connect from each coast that feed into Lake Okeechobee. And for those of you that don't know, you got the Caloosahatchee River, which goes all the way to Fort Myers and comes into the lake right here. And you've got the St. Lucie Canal that comes into the lake up here on the east side from the Port Mayaca Lock. And both of those, if you get in your boat, you can go from anywhere in the lake and make it out into the Gulf or into the Atlantic Ocean from there. So it makes sense that there's tarpon and snook in here, and that you'll have the random fish that gradually makes their way into the lake. They do have to go through a boat lock, so they have to literally kind of lock through with a big barge or a big boat that happens to be going a certain way, in the canal. But there are times where I have seen the Port Mayaca lock left open. I've never seen the Moorhaven lock left open, but it's the same deal. I mean, some days there's 50, 60 boats going through those locks in a day, especially when a lot of people are moving their boats north for the summertime, or south for the wintertime. And those snook just kind of get pushed into areas whether they want to or not. So hearing the occasional catch or capture of a snook or a tarpon or a sighting of one was not uncommon. But when I moved up here, I really started trying to do, like, I guess I could say, my research on the number of snook and tarpon in the lake, because it was just, I always thought it was so cool, and crazy to me that they were here. But the more I really looked into it, I really think there is a much bigger population of these fish in this lake than anyone wants to think about. Um, and I know I've myself probably caught in the I'm going to say in the last 4 years, myself, I've probably caught 8 snook in the lake, and I, I've I don't know how many tarpon I've caught. I know I had one day inside the lake that I landed 7, and I probably jumped another 15. Um, and kind of that bite is what really tuned me into, kind of, I think, the population of these fish that call this lake home that no one thinks about. So leading up to that, um, well, let me back up also. As a guide, I take a lot of people fishing that are um, either local or non-local. Maybe they're snowbirds. They come down here every year. They have for the past 35 years, but they just want to go fishing with somebody else, and go fishing with a guide, and they book me. And it's crazy. A lot of times I talk to these people, and um, they have stories about snook or tarpon or jacks that they've hooked inside the lake, and sometimes they have photos of fish that they've caught. And I always ask, like, can you send that to me? Like, I'm not going to really post it anywhere, but I kind of like to almost collect these pictures of these fish, because I run into people in the snook fishing world and the tarpon world, or just the saltwater world, that think I'm full of it, that we have these fish in the lake. Um, and again, talking to all these people on both the north and the south end of the lake, and doing my homework, I mean, I really think, instead of there being just the random occasional fish in here, I think there are thousands of tarpon and snook that live in the lake. My father-in-law, he was fishing a tournament back in 2010, right after we had the major freeze. And well, most of you remember that, like the viral photos of, I believe, of the flamingo boat ramp, where there was just thousands or hundreds or thousands of dead snook floating on top. We had lost a lot of the, that's primarily why the West Coast snook season has been closed for really the past, whatever, 10 years or so, because they had such a hit detrimental hit to their population of fish over there. And Lake Okeechobee was no different. I was not really fishing the lake very much back then in those years, but my father-in-law tells me about him crossing, coming out of the Kissimmee River here to run down to the south end of the lake in a tournament. And he said it was freezing cold still, and he said he was crossing the lake and he saw what looked like an island, more or less, just out in the middle of nowhere. Now, this isn't really uncommon because we will get, storms will blow big tussock mats, big mud mats that have, sticks and willow bushes and stuff growing on them, and they'll just float randomly out in the lake. But this one was really low to the water, and it just had a different color to it. And he said when he rolled up there, there were literally, hundreds of snook and tarpon just basically balled up in a floating mat, floating island of them kind of going across the lake. And basically what had happened was, we were dealing with those cold fronts and those winds were just basically pushing all the junk floating in the lake together. And in this case, the floating junk were fish. Um, and the crazier part of the whole story is him telling me how big these fish were. Okay, now I've personally been fishing with my father-in-law when we've caught 38 to 42-inch fish, on the coasts, on family vacations, and during the mullet run. The guy knows snook and tarpon. He knows their size. And to this day, when we catch these 20 to 25-pound fish on the coast, he'll tell me almost every fish in that flotilla of dying snook that I saw that day were all bigger than these. So they were all 30, I mean, legit, real 30 pounders. Not all of them, but there was a lot of them in there. And when you really stop to think about it, it kind of makes sense because what better place for a snook or a tarpon to live, to grow absolutely massive, especially a snook. I say to this day, I truly believe the state record snook lives inside the walls of Lake Okeechobee because once they get in there, they're obviously acclimated to the fresh water, right? Now they're not fighting current, which could be a good and a bad thing. They have all the bait they could ever possibly want to eat. They have absolutely no pressure and they have no predators for the most part dealing with them. So these fish could just gorge themselves on these giant gizzard shad, bluegill shiners, whatever it might be. And like I said, they're obviously they're not pressured either. Um, so that interested me back then, hearing about how big these fish were. And then, talking to him, he's probably caught more snook in the lake than anyone else that I personally know. I think, like I said, I think I've probably caught 8 or so. He doesn't know how many he's caught. My tournament partner, Kelly, he's caught a fair share of them as well. Um, and I just, I know of a good amount of people that have. The funny thing is, well, I could tell you this. Um, I may have caught closer to 10 snook now. I'm not sure. I don't remember. But I'm going to say 6 of them came from the exact same spot. And, out of from my 6, and I know of probably another 10 that my father-in-law has caught from this same spot, and my partner Kelly has caught 3 or 4 from this spot, and I've guided customers to 2 at the exact same spot. The only reason I think it's weird and something that like I said, I'm trying to put these pieces to this puzzle together is obviously a fish is a fish. There's no fences in the ocean. There's no fences in Lake Okeechobee. We see tarpon rolling back in the grass. We see snook swim back there every now and again. But for the most part, what I could put together is that the snook on the lake, they really like hard structure, meaning rock. They really like rock. So primarily when we're bass fishing on Lake Okeechobee, you're back in the thick grass. You're back in, flipping mats. You're around the eelgrass, what's left of it. You're around the reeds. And not to say that there's not snook there, but it seems like the majority of the fish really like to stay near the deeper water around the harder structure, rock, shell bars, rip wrap in the rim canal, things like that. And I think the reason most of the time um, they're not getting caught as much is because a lot of people that bass fish Lake Okeechobee regularly don't target those areas that are these snooks seem to key in on once they're in the lake. Another thing is bait choice, right? Um, Frogs, flipping, things like that aren't ideal for catching a big snook. Now it does happen. I know Scott Martin caught a good fish flipping reeds one day. Um, I know another buddy of mine who caught a big one on a spinner bait. I know it's funny enough. I know of 3 or 4 snook that have been caught on Carolina rigged Senkos out here. But primarily those better big fish that we've caught have been on rattle traps, jerk baits, and things. And again, it's around hard cover where some of these areas we really have never see anybody else fishing. Same thing kind of goes for the tarpon also. The tarpon are a little bit more random. Uh, and going back to that bite I'm talking about with the tarpon, again, we all know tarpon, snook, they like current. They're born for the most part, they'd rather be in moving water if they have it. We don't have a current flow, a tidal influx on Lake Okeechobee. And primarily, any of the water that is moving in and around the lake is pumping out of the lake. So, like the Moorhaven spillway, that's obviously pumping water west. St. Lucie Canal pumping it east. You've got down here in South Bay and stuff in the canals that lead out of the lake. But as far as current coming into the lake, you've got the Kissimmee River, and there's a couple up here on the north end. Um, I did show up to one of those spillways one time. I was in there trying to bass fish in my boat, and there was flowing water coming out. And as it was coming out, there were some isolated reeds, um, 300 yards out in front of the spillway, and I was throwing a popping frog. And when I went to pull my frog out of the water, there were 3 tarpon just staring up at my frog, and I thought that was so cool. And I just happened to start looking at that running water where I was heading to go throw a rattle trap for see if there was any bass hanging out. And there was one of the biggest schools of tarpon I've ever seen, both in salt or freshwater, just there. Um, I kind of set up in one of the eddies, pulled down, and every time a fish would come up and roll, it wasn't just one, it was between 8 and 25 fish. And before I knew it, once the sun got up and the wind kind of slicked off, I mean, there were tarpon rolling everywhere. And what it came down to was this was the only place in Lake Okeechobee that had water flowing into the actual lake. Um, and it was an ideal scenario. It was no different than a spillway that you find closer to the coast. Um, you know, Around a bridge, there was flowing water, flowing bait to these fish. And during that day, it was really about a week span that I was catching these fish. Every day I went, the amount of tarpon grew. I mean, it was like they were swimming around the lake, finding that flowing water and taking up shop. And some of these fish were good fish. Most of them were the perfect size, from 7 pounds to 25 pounds. I did see a few in the 60 to 70 pound range. I did hook one that was probably a good 60 pounds that I actually was fishing from land that day. And on a Van Stahl 100, I had absolutely no shot. She was just eating it going out and ended up breaking me off. But um, saw some good tarpon. I broke off. I was having to go really light to get these fish to eat. I was only using 25-pound fluoro. I did hook 2 really nice snook. One that frayed me off as I was trying to lip it. That was probably around the upper slot, and another one that, as soon as I set the hook and 20 yards into the run, she frayed off, and I saw her eat at my feet, and she was probably 38 inches long or so. Um, I also during that bite caught 6 or 7 big ladyfish. I mean, studs. Um, really, really, just an odd deal that you go so long without catching any of these species or even seeing them. And I'm on the lake every day. But then once you find a scenario that fits what they look for, they're there. They were there. Um, and, again, a lot of times, like I said, a lot of these other snook we've caught, taking that bite aside and taking it out of the picture, what, that the one area, it's funny, the one spot where we've caught a lot of these fish, which I'm not going to name, it's essentially a boat cut. And if the wind blows a certain direction, it kind of acts like the mouth of an inlet or a spillway. It pushes water in, it kind of eddies around. And just where you would make that cast with a flare hawk jig or big swim bait on the coast around an inlet, you make that same cast with a rattle trap or a jerk bait. Obviously, we're trying to catch bass, and a lot of times that snook will be there, and it's a snook as soon as it eats. I mean, your spool's dumped, and the fish is out there jumping around, and it's pretty crazy. So I've really been wanting to try and figure out how to actually target these fish because I really think there are some. I think there's true giants that live in the lake. Once they're in the lake, as far as I'm concerned, they don't know their way out. Like if a fish comes through the St. Lucie Canal and ends up down here off of Kramer Island, I don't think it could say, you know what, it's time to go back to St. Lucie Inlet and swim back and go back the way it came. I could be wrong. Um, these fish do move fast. They definitely do have a sense of direction. Like when I go fishing with my buddy Dale Ash, the Jupiter Snooker in Jupiter, that's one of the coolest things that I take away from fishing with him is it's a lot of visual fishing, and these fish move a lot more than I ever thought they did. And they're on a mission when they're moving a lot of times. The only difference is there they have a current. They have that incoming and outgoing tide, right, where they can kind of follow the salinity of the water. They could follow the way that the current's pushing them. And I feel like that kind of gives them a sense of direction. Whereas here, they don't have anything to go by. Um, big crevels. There are some really, really good sized crevels in the lake. Um, when you see them, it's funny. Back in the day, anytime I used to fish any backwater areas like in Boca Raton, all the way to Fort Pierce, I remember we used to go chase those giant single waking jack crevels around the backwaters of Fort Pierce. And you think of a jack, you think of anything that hits in front of it, they're going to eat. But if they were in that backwater, it was almost impossible to get them to eat. And that's kind of what it's like on the lake. You'll see them head waking out there every now and again, especially when the lake's super slick calm. You'll be running across the lake and you'll just see that head wake going. Um, but they won't eat nothing, at least, in my experience. But there are some good ones out there. I know of people that have, I mean, my wife chased them for hours one day. Said it looked just like bonitas blowing up sardines all around the lake. And they're moving quick, eating those shad. And I know people that have um, seen wads of five to. One gentleman I know said he saw a wad that there was probably 300 jacks swimming around his boat. These were smaller. These were 5 to 7 pound fish, and they wouldn't eat anything. But they're in there. Ladyfish. I've never heard of a redfish. I had one gentleman tell me he's caught some back in the day. This guy was probably in his 70s, and he said when he was a kid, they used to catch some giant flounder on the north end of the lake. I'm not going to disregard it because you never know. Something I tell people, it wasn't until, you know, the 1900s where, this used to just flow all the way down to the Florida Everglades. There was nothing stopping these fish at all from just making their way up into the lake. Now all we've done is just reduced it. Now they have to come through only one of these two locations, but those rivers and canals have been there since I think 41 is when the St. Lucie Canal. So you're talking almost 100 years of time for those fish to make their way into the lake. I've never heard of a sea trout. Um, I know of people that net giant maharas, big sand perch, or catch them, I should say, while speck fishing, while crappie fishing, which is pretty cool. Another crazy thing too, in regards to the jacks, the snooks, and the tarpon. Growing up, if you were ever fishing backwater residential canals, like for me, it was like back in the El Rio or the Hillsborough Canal in Deerfield, in Boca Raton, some of those dead end canals in the Lighthouse Point area, way back up in the river in Jupiter, whatever. When you catch a snook back there, you could tell that they're a backwater fish. They're very dark in color and black, right? Almost every snook, tarpon, or jack that we see get caught out of the lake looks like you just pulled them out of Palm Beach Inlet in the summertime. The fins are lit up. The fish are very silver. It's something I can't really put a finger on. A lot of people say, "Oh, well, when you catch a snook out there, it probably looks like hell." No, they're like the healthiest fish you'll ever catch. And I think a part of that is they're not getting beat up because they're not fighting current. They're not getting chased around by sharks and kudas and people. And they can just sit there and gorge on shad. And shad are very, very easy to both catch and digest for them, which is something it's really crazy. And then you got to remember, too, for both the snook and the tarpon, they're coming from the east and the west coast. And most of you know there's not a big difference between a West Coast and a East Coast snook, but you can usually tell the difference. A snook on the East Coast is usually much girthier, um, and has more mass than a lot of the fish on the West Coast. But from what I've seen, um, I feel like most of the fish that I encounter actually in the lake are coming from the East Coast. They look more like East Coast fish. Now, what's funny also is if you ever go fishing in one of these canals that lead off of the lake, I feel like there are 100,000 times more snook in the west in the Caloosahatchee. The amount of snook in that canal system is unreal. That's something else that really intrigued me, and I've started to pick up and learn. And maybe it's the same in the St. Lucie, but maybe they're just not as easy to catch. I'm not sure. But I get asked all the time. There is a very big population of these fish in here, and kind of the whole reason this topic got brought up is the science says that snook need some certain level of salinity for their eggs to become fertile and hatch out. And I get that's what the science says, but I don't think that's true. And I'm not a scientist and I'm not a pro and I don't know everything and I hardly know anything at all. But there have been instances where I've been in the lake and seen legit hatchling snook. I was at Boy Scout Cut. This was a few years ago, right here. We had, again, perfect scenario. We had a north wind, or we had a few. We really had like a day and a half of hard, hard, hard bad thunderstorms coming across the lake from the north. And when I was coming in, where the cut is in the rim canal, there was, I mean, like an inlet like current pushing in from the lake, going into the rim canal and eddying out. It was crazy. And there was just a wad of small to medium sized shad just stacked on this ledge. And I was there throwing a rattle trap and dragging a worm for bass. But just like a mullet run scenario or pilchards, around the summertime on the beach, when that bait would ball up, there were dozens of snook, 12 inches long, and back flipping through them. And I went to a crappie jig and a little swim bait I used for specks trying to catch them, and I never got one to bite. But clear as day, silver with bright yellow fins, back flipping out of the water, and they're this big. So I don't know how old a 12-inch snook is. I don't know, but I just think it's pretty crazy. I think the chances are much more likely that that fish hatched out in this lake than they are that the fish came from St. Lucie Inlet all the way through the St. Lucie Lock, came through two boat locks, didn't get eaten, didn't get messed up, swam all the way down, 25 miles to there where I saw it. You got to remember also, back let's just go back 2,000 years ago. All right, when this was a natural deal down to the Keys, down to the Florida Everglades. When all of this started changing and progress came and we started developing down the south end of the lake and all that, which is a very touchy subject, but I do live here in Belglade. Um, there's no telling how many fish just were already in there when we dammed it up with the dike and things. And over time, these fish, I feel like maybe have adapted, and maybe they do spawn. Maybe they do. Maybe they have a seasonal deal that they do, um, where they go and they have a spawning situation, or they have places they go and try to spawn. Maybe not all of the eggs take. Maybe only a small percentage of them, but I do think that a lot of these fish actively spawn in the lake. Same thing with the tarpon. Was out the other day and had some tarpon rolling around the boat that were literally, I mean, 18 inches long. Um, and there's giant tarpon in here also. I remember this, I guess it was a year ago. Me and my wife were fishing a tournament again. We were sitting here in the basin in the rim canal out of Torrey Island waiting for boat takeoff, and about 100 pounder just between there were 60 boats sitting out there, just airs it out, backflips out of the water, free jumper, lands in the water. So there's big fish in here also. I believe once they get in here, they'll grow very fast. I don't have photos. I don't have documented proof this is like a UFO sighting, but I believe I've seen two bull sharks in the lake also, which to me, bull sharks being in here, thriving in here, is a lot less impressive than Jack Crevalles. I mean, seeing these Jack Crevalles in here is the craziest thing ever also. But like I said, I've never seen a redfish or heard of a redfish. Never heard of a speckled trout. Some guy said about a flounder. I think someone told me about a sheep's head, maybe. But again, this is all he said, she said stuff. So till I see photos. So if any of you have photos or you have stories about seeing big snook or tarpon or jacks in the lake, definitely leave it in the comments. I want to try and dial in a way to target these fish in here because they're huge. It's like a needle in a haystack deal. I do know of one that was probably pushing 30 pounds that was caught in the Kissimmee River about 2 months ago on a crappie jig. Believe it or not, I don't know if the guy hooked a speck and the snook ate it, but he landed it. But this fish was probably a 42 to 44-inch fish and was really pushing that 30-pound mark. Giant fish. I don't remember the guy's name who caught it. Um, or I'd plug him. I don't know if he's listening to this. Caught it on the last spillway going up the river. I forget what they call it, Snake River or whatever. I follow you on Instagram and I can't think of his name, but he's also an avid saltwater fisherman. Fishes looks like Fort Pierce, Sebastian Inlet, and things. So I should have messaged him about the fish, but it was kind of a going around my little social circle how big the fish was. And I know of another one that was caught up that same river a month before that. That was probably 38 inches on a X wrap. I have a lot of old timers tell me back in the day they used to go up there and throw flare hawks and bombers at that spillway in the lake, just like we would on the coast and catch big snook. So there is a healthy population. I have video. I have you guys. If you guys are new to my channel, you can look up tarpon fishing Lake Okeechobee. I don't have much video of me catching snook. I might have caught a small snook in the actual video, but um, the tarpon population was crazy, and they're still in here. And once that water stopped running and they turned the pumps off, those fish disappeared, and I've never seen anything like that again since. I think it was just kind of a perfect case scenario. Did the fish leave? Did they go out in the middle of the lake? I don't know. But I seen some tarpon this summer. I don't believe I caught any this summer, but I saw a good amount rolling all over the lake. I saw a few down here in Pelican Bay the other day. I saw a few up here at Blue Hole with my buddy Dan. Trying to think where else I saw some. Mouth of the river. I saw some tarpon the other day, so they're in here. So I just thought maybe you guys would think that's pretty cool. If you guys have any questions about it, leave them in the comments. And if you guys have any catches of your own that I missed, I'd love to hear about them because this whole topic just totally intrigues me. And yeah, anybody who has more knowledge on the spawning in fresh water and things, leave a comment below because I'd love to hear it. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm not saying you're wrong, but it's just crazy to think that these little baby snook would come from that far. But anything is possible. So appreciate you guys watching. Um, and hopefully kind of getting out of that season now where they're very um, common, the snook and the tarpon. Summertime is kind of the time to go target them. Getting into winter now, but maybe by next year, or maybe we'll have a scenario pop up this fall where I can go try to target some big snook and tarpon in the lake, and I'll try to have the cameras rolling. So appreciate you guys watching, and I'll see you guys on the next one.